Thank you for joining me for this episode of God Talk, and a happy 4th of July to everyone listening, or it's going to be around the time of 4th of July, depending when you listen to it. But we are in a 7-part series in which we're looking at what are the most Googled questions about God, and this is part 6 of the 7 parts. And what we want to look at in this episode is the Bible reliable? Some of people's greatest questions about the Bible is, well, how do I know? There's so many translations. How do I know which one's real, which one's right? And it really just comes down to like the reliability of it. But people have these questions about the reliability of the Bible and have really no understanding on how translations even come about. And so in this episode of God Talk, we're going to talk a little bit about how we get the different translations of the Bible, if they are reliable, and how do we know that they're reliable? Because the perception is that I write the first Bible, and then someone takes my work and they write it off my work, and that someone writes it from their work, and everyone's just kind of copying the person before them. And so the reason that doesn't sound really good to us is most of us have played the game of telephone, in which you whisper something into someone's ear. They think they hear what you say, and then they whisper it into the next person, and once you get past 5, 6, 7, 10 people, I mean, it's not going to be remotely close to what it started out as. And people think that that's how the Bible's translated, and it's not. It is absolutely not translated that way. It's not copied from one person to the next. And even with that said, it's still not comparable to the game of telephone, in which you whisper something into someone's ear once, and then they have to go forward with it when they're not even sure maybe what it is that you completely said. That's not a similar comparison. And it's also not a similar comparison because, when it comes to God's word, it wasn't spoken. I mean, initially it was, but then it becomes written in writing. And this isn't just some ordinary person's word. This is God's word, and they took great care and great precision in passing along the God's word, because it's God's word. You don't want to mess that up. Like if it's just like some summary of something you read on a billboard, and then if you don't quote it exactly right, not a big deal, right? But when it's God's word, like, you're going to want to take the time. If you fear God, you're going to want to take the time to get it right. So get the game of telephone out of your head. It is not remotely in any way, shape, or form like the game of telephone. All right. So how do translations work? Well, translations go back to the original. In other words, let's say I wrote the first version, you wrote the second, your cousin Esther wrote the third, and then Uncle Frank wrote the fourth. Uncle Frank is not going to look at what cousin Esther did. Uncle Frank is only going to look at what Greg did. You always go back to the oldest, and you always go back to the original, and then you translate it again. Why would you translate it again? Because modern language changes. So like English today is different than what English was 200 or 300 years ago. So you would do it to update the language, or if you're going from one language to the next, but you do not go off of copies of the original translation. You reach back to the first translation you have, the oldest translation you have, the most reliable translation that you have, and that is always the springboard to the next one. So for the last 2,000 years, there have been people translating the Bible, and no one is translating. No credible translation is built off of any other translation other than going back to the oldest and most reliable manuscripts and translations we have. Now, over the years, over the last 1,000 years, as we have more archaeology, and in that those archaeological digs, more translations are being found, and they date those and can figure out about when those were written. Like there might be some changes in terms of which manuscript, which part of a parchment, a part of a manuscript that things are being translated off of. But the reality is because of the great care that was done in those translations, that there's still not a difference, because that there's not going to be any theological fundamental difference between any of the translations in the manuscripts that we found in the early church, because people took that kind of care when they were recording uh, these documents, and they were passing them along. The best example of this still, it has to be when people found the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there was some shepherd boy that was going through with his sheep through just real arid regions, and there are caves up in the side of the hills. And he was just throwing rocks. He was throwing rocks from down below, trying to throw them into the caves up above. And as he threw a rock into one of the caves, he heard a crash, a shatter. And he went up to investigate. And this is how the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Well, what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, they were a bunch of writings that were put in these caves around the time that Jerusalem was being destroyed by the Romans to preserve antiquity. And so the Old Testament were put into these caves, into these jars, to keep them safe and preserve them. But so were other writings as well. And so before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, like that, the oldest manuscript of the Old Testament that we had was probably dated. I can't remember if it's 1500, it might have been like 1200, like 1200 AD. So it was 1200 years after the time of Christ. And that was the oldest copies of the Old Testament we had. So everyone was like, you know what, this isn't even what the Old Testament would have looked like. These come, over 1,000 years after even Jesus. There's no way that they're reliable. And how do you refute it other than, oh, they're reliable because this was a process by which it was done. The scribes would memorize this stuff. They would take great care, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, sure they would. Like, how do you prove that? Well, here's how you prove it. They found these manuscripts that were 1,000 years older than any other manuscript that we had in our possession. And guess what? They were like 99.8% similar. No significant difference in terms of in terms of theology. And why 99.8, not 100? Well, they probably misspelled a word, or left off one stroke of a lettering or something like that, right? Minor things. So it was basically identical, and this is not refuted. It's not up for dispute. Like, it was identical, and 1,000 years had passed between those manuscripts that were written. That is the care by which is used when you translate the Bible. It is God's word. Listen, you don't want to get your boss's word wrong. Like, if you're telling your coworker, okay, the boss said that this project's due and it's due on such and such date by such and such time, you don't want to get that wrong. You're going to get fired. Like, if you're going to care about what your boss says and passing along that information, how much more so if you believe in God, if you fear God, are you going to get that right as you pass that along? All right. So now there's a method by which it's determined what are the most reliable translations, and the oldest and so forth. But there's four main rivers from the New Testament, and I'm speaking more about the New Testament for this, because let's just say, like, is the Bible reliable? We're going to have to say that if Jesus was quoting it and Jesus was okay with the Old Testament, then we've got to be okay with it. And we know that we have the exact same Old Testament that Jesus had, because when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found out that it's the exact same as what they had in the time of Christ. So let's just take the Old Testament off the table, and then let's talk about the New Testament. So what happens is the author will write something, and then that will be distributed to the church. and the church is located in different parts of the world, right? As the church is spreading out. So there's four main rivers in which you have four different kind of translation streams that go out from the original. There's the Alexandrian, um, and so that's like more Greek type translations. You've got the Egyptian translations. You've got the Western translations. You've got the Byzantine translations. And then we have something called the eclectic. And the eclectic is like, it's a compilation of all of them. So you would take your best of your Alexandrian, your best of your Egyptian, your Western Byzantine, and you could compile that to be a source all in of itself, almost like a fifth stream. It wasn't composed that way, but we can go back even 100 years, 150 years after the time of Christ, uh, take some fragments from the Alexandrian, take some from the Egyptians, from the Western, the Byzantine, and you can compile that together to this kind of compilation type river. It's an artificial river. It's a man-made river that's able to be done after the fact. So I hope that makes sense. But the earliest manuscripts that we have come from the Alexandrian, and that would make sense because the New Testament's written in Greek, and this is more of the Greek stream of the translations of the Bible, written in Greek, propagated and expanded to a Greek world. And those manuscripts go back as far as like 100 years AD. So we're talking about 70, not less than 70. We're talking about probably about 60 years after the time of Christ's death and resurrection. So it goes quite a ways back. And so you've got that river of translations over the course of time. Then the Egyptian translations, the earliest copies of those start in the 300s. Then the Western translations, they start as early as the 200s and kind of last for 200 or 300 years, and then like they kind of go dry. Like then we lose the additional manuscripts from that haven't been found, but we have the early ones, and then the Byzantine, and that's where we've got the most copies of the Bible, dating back to the 200s, some of the early manuscripts, but then being represented really from there on through like the time of the Reformation. And so what's interesting is you look at these different streams, and even though some are going, say, towards Egypt and feed off of the Egyptians, passing it along to other groups, and then you have like the Alexandrian and the Western, like they all, even though there are streams that are flowing in different directions, they all line up, they all match. There's no significant differences between Matthew in the Byzantine thread of say Matthew, or the Western, or the Egyptian, or the Alexandrian. These are that's the headwaters, right? Like the person writes it. You've got four channels that go from that in different directions to different parts of the world. And even though these are being translated one upon another in different directions of the world, they're consistent with each other. So if you think about that, it's crazy. It's mind blowing that you can have translation streams going in different directions of the world, and there's no cross pollinating of them. There's no bringing them back together, but they remain true to the original source by which they all come from. They're all fed from the same original source. When it comes to manuscripts and reliability, think about this. Caesar wrote some different things, and he wrote would have been from like 100 years before the time of Christ to about 44 years from the time of Christ. The earliest manuscript of anything that we have that Caesar wrote comes like 1,000 years later, and we've got 10 manuscripts of it. So there's 1,000-year gap between when Caesar wrote things and when the earliest copies that we have of it, and we only have 10 different manuscripts. Plato wrote 400 to 347 years before Christ. The earliest fragment we have from Plato is 900 years after the time of Christ. And so you've got a 1200-year gap, and we only have 7 manuscripts. Homer with the Iliad, it was written 900 years BC. The earliest copy we found, and it's crazy, it's 400 BC, so 400 years before the time of Christ, we have a copy of Homer's Iliad, but there's 500 years gap between when he wrote it and what we have. And there's 640 copies of that. Now, the New Testament was written around 40 AD to 100 AD. The earliest fragment we have is about 120 AD. And so you're talking about only a 25 to 50 year span before we have copies of what was written. And we've got 24,000 manuscripts or partial manuscripts. So, like, no one questions when you read, like, Homer's Iliad that he wrote it. People aren't trying to figure out what he really wrote, but there's a 500-year gap. No one's trying to figure out what Caesar really wrote, and there's a 1,000-year gap. And for the New Testament, it's 25 to 50-year gap from when it was written to the copies that we possess, at least partial copies, and we got 24,000 of them. The earliest fragment of the New Testament. A fragment means it's not a whole book. It might be just part of a verse or a part of a chapter. The earliest fragment we've got comes from 114, around 114 AD. So we're looking at about 50 plus years after the time of Christ's death and resurrection. The first full books that we have, where we don't just have like parts of, say, Matthew, parts of John, but we start now having full books of the Bible. That's around the year 200 after the time of Christ. So that's like 100-year gap between when they were written and when we have possession of them. We have most of the New Testament, almost all of the books of the New Testament. We have that by the year 250. It's only 150 years after when they were written. We have a complete version of the New Testament by 325, and that's 225 years after they were written. And of that, then there's 5,366 copies of those different things from that time period, from the first 325 years. 5,366 copies, some 24,000 copies altogether of antiquity of the New Testament. So, can you rely on it? Absolutely, you can. Now, you don't have to agree with it. Like, if you don't believe it, then fine, don't believe it. I mean, it's called faith. If you believe in God, then good. If you don't, we can't make you. But if you believe in God, can you rely on the Bible? Absolutely. It's 100%, without any question, reliable. More documented proof for that than anything else in antiquity. All right, so the last thing I want to kind of cover is, why do we have different translations? There's the King James Version. Some people are like, oh, that's the only good version. And then there's the New International Version. There's the New King James Version. There's the Revised Standard Version. There's the English Standard Version. There's all these different versions. Why are all these different versions out there? Well, the answer is because each version has kind of a different emphasis. It can either go for literal word for word, like it says this in the Hebrew, it says this in the Greek, word for word, or it can be more concerned with translating meaning. And what do I mean by that? Well, if I was to say, like, Jeff is hard-headed, well, a word for word translation would be Jeff was hard-headed. But that's not what that really means. Jeff might not have a hard head. In fact, he might have a soft head. He maybe has had 12 concussions in his life. We're not really talking about Jeff's hardness of his head when I say Jeff is hard-headed. So what does that mean? Well, it just means that, like, he's going to do things his own way. He doesn't listen to other people. He's impossible to talk to, right? So there's the spectrum in translations. They're either going to be on one side of that, like Jeff is hard-headed, or Jeff is impossible to talk to, where it's going to explain what the author's really writing and what it means. And then there's the whole spectrum in between. So the interlinear is really good about being a word for word translation. You're going to miss some meaning, but you'll know exactly what the author says. The message is good at trying to communicate the meaning, but it takes sometimes too much liberty trying to understand what the meaning is, and doesn't do a really good enough job at saying what the author really said. And so the best ones to me are the ones that are in the middle. And the ones that are in the middle are like the NIV, the New English Translation. If you want to get more to the literal side, the the New King James Version is really good. And the ESV is really good. The only reason I don't use the ESV for church is because it's such an accurate literal translation of the Bible. It's somewhat stilted. It's awkward to read out loud. It doesn't flow nicely. It's not wordy enough. So that's why I prefer the NIV, which is like smack dab in the middle of the spectrum. But the different translations are also written at different educational levels. So, for instance, the New International Reader's Version is written on a third grade level. I think of the major translations, that is the easiest to understand because it's written for a third grader, to really understand. The NIV, by comparison, is trying to find it. New International Version, 8th grade. So a middle school level version of the Bible. Then the King James Version is like 13th grade. So that's like a college level understanding of reading. So it's written at a much higher level. Amplified Bible is 12th grade. So the different translations are written more brainy than others. So how do you pick your translation? Well, do you want more literal, or do you want more like what it means? Do you want more easy to understand because it's written to the comprehension level of a younger child, or of a college educated man or woman? Like, you have your choice. Once again, I tend to work from the NIV, but even though that is like at an 8th grade level, sometimes I'm like, I'm really not sure which way to take this. I might look at like the New Century Version, which is on a 5th grade level or something like that, to see how it translates it, and then I might cross it over to the ESV, which is written on almost a 10th grade level, and looking at sometimes multiple translations helps us to get to maybe the best intent of what the author originally had in mind. I hope this helps. I find that people always have lots of questions on how we get the Bible, which is actually another discussion, which I think I've actually talked about before in my podcast. But I know I haven't talked about the reliability of the Bible, and also how we get these different translations. I have talked about that in Bible classes in person, but I don't think I've talked about either of those when it comes to my podcast. So I hope it helps clear up some maybe questions you had in your mind. And I hope you have a wonderful 4th of July. If you're listening to this before the 4th, if you've already had it, I hope it was a good one. And I look forward to talking to you next week. God bless all of you.